In the last episode, we heard how David, a college student in his 20s, found out that his grandfather was a high-profile Greek communist who was executed in the 1950s.
I typed in Agriadis and, I thought, oh my God, what happened here? It was just this unbelievable discovery. And that's when I saw his picture of him on the page. And, it's that classic moment when you realize, whoa, that looks just like my mom. That is strange.
David's mother, Joan, was adopted from Greece to the United States under strange circumstances. The 1950s are a dark chapter in Greek history, but as it turns out, also in American history. I'm walking in D.C. I can't say where I am or who I just met. I can't describe him, so I don't even know why I'm recording myself right now. I just met someone in the CIA. This is me speaking on my phone just minutes after meeting a secret agent. Let me tell you how it was arranged. I was visiting a journalist friend who lives in Washington, D.C. to help me find information in the archives on American interference in Greece in the 1950s. My friend mentioned he had a good source in the CIA who might be willing to speak to me about that time period.
If you want, you can describe me as a former CIA officer.
A CIA officer with intimate knowledge of Greek affairs. This is not his real voice, as he does not want to be identified.
When I was assigned my first Greek case, I was asked to go to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center in Langley, Virginia, and study the Greek files. I'm not exaggerating to you when I say the Greek files were 6 feet tall, 4 stacks of them going back to the early 1950s. And I was sitting there one day in my cubicle, reading these files, and I said out loud, "Oh my God." And this man on the other side of the cubicle, who I didn't even see there, he stood up and he said, "You're reading the Greek files?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "That's how everybody reacts to the Greek files."
Because of the volume, or because of what you were reading, I ask.
Because of what I was reading, to the point of what we would today consider to be irrationality. Some agents just as soon kill a Greek communist as kill a German Nazi or a Soviet communist.
Remember, since the 1920s, the US government has been starkly anti-communist. So much so that in 1967, they played a well-documented role in installing a brutal anti-communist dictatorship in Greece. What I want to know is if the US government was in any way actively involved in the executions of communists, like the execution of Joan's father, Ilias Argyriadis. The US ambassador to Greece, John Purifoy, was vocally anti-communist. And some 36 hours before the executions, Purifoy dispatched a telegram to the US Department of State reporting the verdict of the trial. His tone was a bit disparaging. He opened with the phrase, "fate of convicted commies," and he distinguished between small fry and big shots. The big shot was Nikos Belogiannis, a legendary name in Greek communist history. Small fry would be Ilias Argyriadis.
It sounds awful to say it, and I'm glad that I won't be quoted by name to say this, but at the time, the Greek government did exactly as Washington told it to do.
So if the Americans wanted to stop the execution of Ilias Argyriadis and his comrades, they could have.
Absolutely. They could have stopped it with a phone call.
But they didn't. You're listening to Born Greek, Made American, a podcast series about adoption, trauma, and politics. Episode 2, Effie, A Life in Waiting. I'm Katerina Bakogianni. As you know, David's mom Joan and her sister Olympia were adopted and brought from Greece to the US. We're going to get into why Joan and Olympia were adopted and what these adoptions have to do with the American relationship to Greece in the next episode. But first, let me tell you about Effie, the third sister. She was the oldest and technically a half-sister, though they all lived together as one family. This sister wasn't adopted by Americans. She never left Greece. Her name is Effie Argyriadi. At the time of their father's arrest in 1951, Joan was 6 years old and her younger sister Olympia was only 2 years old. Effie was 13. She wasn't an adult yet, but she was old enough to understand what was going on. They all lived together as a family, 2 parents and the 3 girls, in their white house by the sea. The house even had a name, Avra, which in Greek means sea breeze. It had 2 large bedrooms, a large living room, and a big kitchen. Just across the street was a private elementary school where little Joan went every morning, attending 1st grade. All this is to say that Argyriadis had the presence of a peaceful family man, while in reality he was treading between life and death as a member of the underground operation of the Communist Party.
Argyriadis is someone who belongs to the Greek left, and
This is Alexander Kitrev, a professor of history at Haverford College. I spoke to him to learn more about David's grandfather and the tensions between the left and the right in Greece.
we have to understand that the Greek left, especially in the early part of the 1940s, was shouldering the weight of resistance against the Nazis and energizing the resistance movement in cities and up in the mountains and the free areas. So the left at the time, which included the Communist Party, which was the strongest element of the left, nonetheless was advocating for a free democratic Greece, didn't really have a communist agenda. And what happened was, after Greece was liberated, there was a clash between the left and the right over who would govern Greece in the post-war era, and the right, with the help of the British and then the Americans, in a sense took over, and the left, which had played such an important role, was not only sidelined but actually suppressed. The Communist Party was made illegal. And then the Communist Party itself reacted against this repression and began what is known as the Greek Civil War.
Argyriadis was on the side of the communists in that war.
He was an idealist. He was part of that tradition of the 1940s that was fighting for a better Greece, a more equitable Greece, a freer Greece. And he had survived throughout the 1940s, and the struggle in the 1950s had taken on this other form. The Communist Party was illegal.
Underneath Argyriadis' beautiful home was an underground cellar, where he was hiding a wireless set that was sending signals to Bucharest, where the Greek communist leadership were in exile. I've seen pictures of the cellar, printed in the newspapers, on the day he was arrested. The hidden opening was very small, but once in, there was enough space for someone to stand and also move around. There was even a bed in the room. Joan never spoke about the cellar, or her father's execution and her traumatic childhood. She never once mentioned she had an older sister. It was like Effie did not exist for Joan. But Effie does exist.
Καλώς την Κατερίνα. Καλώς ήρθατε.
Τι κάνετε?
Χαίρομαι που γνωριζόμαστε και από κοντά.
Κατερίνα μου, καλώς ήρθες.
Καθίστε. Καφέ?
Effie still lives in the same place where it all happened more than 70 years ago, gazing at the same view of the sea. These days, she cannot move easily. She lies mostly in bed, or on the rare occasion she has visitors, like me today, on the living room couch. She's constantly in pain, yet she does not show it. I can only tell she's hurting because once in a while, as we talk, she will rub one of her legs. So on some days when I was there, Nikos, her devoted husband for almost half a century, would step in and give me the details. Here he is, telling me about Ilias Argyriadis, Effie and Joan's father.
Ήταν ικανός.
He was a very talented craftsman with a huge reputation. They called him Iphaistos, like the god, because of his ability to make things. He was working as an electrical engineer in the power generation company, and he was arrested and sent to exile for joining the Union.
To add some context here, it is impossible to compare the Greek trade unions with the American ones of the same period. The unions in Greece were heavily persecuted and as a result became directly affiliated to the Communist Party. Argyriadis was arrested and exiled for years under terrible conditions, and then, when he was released, he joined the resistance against the Germans up in the Greek mountains. Nikos tells me he spent so many years fighting that he hadn't seen Effie or anyone else in his family for years. When they met again, he didn't recognize his own daughter.
If one takes a close look back into the life of Argyriadis, he will see that it was an uphill battle in every step. He sacrificed his life for the common cause.
And he sacrificed his family. On the night of the 13th November 1951, 3 hours after midnight, more than 100 men of the Greek security police and the army arrested Argyriadis in his home with the purpose of breaking down the Communist Party. I had to visit Effie many times for her to finally agree to share her story. It is painful for her to remember and difficult to retell it. What you're about to hear is an extraordinary narrative of how two little girls, Effie and Joan, experienced together the arrest and execution of their father, and of how they were suddenly separated. It sheds light into why Joan was the way she was later in life.
It was the middle of the night, but the sky was clear.
This is not actually Effie speaking, but what Effie would sound like if she spoke English. Effie is voiced by her daughter Iliana, named after her grandfather Elias. Iliana is an actress.
I saw a man crawling on the fence. He came close, and then he jumped inside. "Get up," he told me. I had no other choice but to follow him. When I entered our living room, all I could see was black. The black uniforms of the security police.
Effie didn't have to ask where her father was.
I knew immediately that they had got to him. They killed my father, I thought.
Less than 24 hours later, Joan and Olympia's mother and Effie's stepmother, Katerina Dalla, was put in a car and taken for interrogation at the security police headquarters in downtown Athens.
I remember it was an American car, a station wagon with wood paneling.
They kept her for 10 days. When she came back, she was a shadow of herself and her head was in bandages.
The police told me that she had hit her head on the wall, but Katerina told me that she was tortured in the same way the Germans used to torture prisoners of war. They put a metal vise around her head so she would confess that her husband was a traitor.
With her stepmother back at home, they start planning. They decide Effie would try to visit Argyriadis in jail the next day to give him the good news that they're all together again. Katerina, Effie, and her two little sisters. There is no sign of what is to come.
Joan and Olympia were very happy that their mother was back home. We stayed up all night talking about what we could do to help my father.
In the morning, Effie gets up. She was ironing some clothes to take to her father when...
Suddenly, Joan storms in my room, shouting to me to run to help her mother. She was frantic. "Run, Effie. My mother has gone crazy. You must do something.
Effie ran to the bathroom and saw her stepmother swallowing pills. She tried to put her hand into her mouth to make her vomit, but Katerina resisted.
She kept saying, "Let me die, let me die." The police were around, but they did nothing. They just stood watching. Our neighbors were afraid to come close. I ran to find a phone to call an ambulance. When I came back, it was too late. Katerina died in my arms.
Effie was left alone with her two younger sisters.
Joan fell in my lap and started to scream. I hate my mother. I hate her for what she did. I did my best to console her. No, my love, I told her. Your mother loved you, but she was not herself.
Effie had no choice but to take over and assume a mother's role. She was the oldest.
I stayed with my sisters. I felt it was my duty to protect them. Joan was very mature for her age. Olympia would sing all day. My father used to call her the singer. I did what I could, what my instincts told me.
What happened in the next few days is to me one of the most astonishing parts of the story. How no one stepped in to help Effie. No relatives, no neighbors, not even Effie's own mother. Remember, Effie was Argyriades' child from his first marriage, who knew that her daughter was left alone with her two half-sisters. Effie reminds me it was an era of oppression and persecution. Even just seen speaking to a communist, in this case a communist's 13-year-old daughter, was dangerous. No one wanted trouble with the police. While Argyriades remains imprisoned, his children become the most politicized children of Greece. Members of the right-wing government immediately set out to shape public opinion on the younger Argyriades sisters. The case made front-page news. On November 30, 1951, just 3 days after their mother's suicide, and with the imprisoned Argyriades still awaiting trial, an article appeared in a popular newspaper of the times. I'm going to read parts of it to you, translated from Greek. What will become of the children of Ilias Argyriades, who is being held at the security headquarters, and of course, rightly so? Will society let some suspect family round them up, so that they too will end up being poisoned? At stake are Greek children. We want them to be given back to us, regardless of whether they have lived in a communist climate. And it would therefore be inhumane if we were to leave those two unfortunate little children to their fate. A week later, the police knocked on their door.
One morning, some days after Katerina's suicide, the police came into the house and tried to take the girls. Joan was screaming at me, not to let go of her. Olympia started crying. For a while, I was fighting with the police. I was kicking them and pushing them away, but in the end, they took the girls.
It all lasted less than a minute. They were separated. The last time Effie saw Joan was at the foster home where she was kept on the day their father, Ilias Argyriades, was executed.
It was an old stone house with a green door. Joan was waiting for me in the yard. She just looked at me and asked, "Is it true?" I nodded. There was nothing else to say. We just stayed together for a while, hugging and crying. Then I was kicked away and they never let me see her again.
Effie tried to visit Joan again a few times, but she was always turned away. One day, they told her the girls had left.
I had no idea where they were. It was like they had vanished.
They did vanish, in a way. For decades, Effie lost every trace of her two sisters. Still, she wouldn't give up. She went everywhere looking for answers. Government offices, state agencies, welfare services. She even made an appeal through the International Red Cross, but nothing came of that either. I think there's a paradox here. Effie was determined to find out what happened to Joan and Olympia after they left Greece, when years later, David, her nephew who she didn't know existed, started the same quest on the reverse. David was desperate to find out what had happened to Joan before she arrived in America.
It's like once a little information comes, you want more, and then all of a sudden it's an avalanche, and now you're skiing down the slope and everything's moving. It's a deluge, you know?
This is David again, Joan's son. David was in college when he found out he was related to Argyriadis. He told a friend of his who was Greek, and the friend was astounded.
So I remember Yorgos was like, "Are you kidding me? These were huge people in our history. This is your grandfather." So in seeing just how stupefied he was, it's kind of like, what am I getting myself into?
David embarked on a crash course in Greek history and learned everything there was to know about the Greek civil war between the right and the left, and how the right prevailed and went after the communists with a vengeance.
Greek communists were treated like they were infected, that had some kind of ailment or sickness that needed to be exorcised from them.
In trying to put together small pieces of Greek history, David started to change. He started to realize how severed he was from his Greek heritage. As he was growing up, there was nothing Greek in their house. No Greek food, no Greek music, or any of the other things of the traditional Greek-American upbringing. Joan was 10 years old when she left Greece. Yet it was almost like she came from another country.
I think my mom just wanted distance from it all. And that probably translated into, how I was brought up. There was no cultural Greekness at the house. I felt Irish growing up.
David grew up wearing Irish knit sweaters and learning everything about Michael Collins and the Revolution. He had a Guinness poster in his room. It's not just the name, David Whelan, which is the same as his father's name, David Whelan Sr. He says that his father had an identity to give to him. His mother did not. They had gone to Ireland as a family, but never to Greece. So every time he heard Joan speak Greek, like at a Greek restaurant, when she would translate the menu for him and his dad,
it was always a total surprise. Like, whoa, my mom speaks Greek? That's strange, There was a private thing inside her, Yeah, I don't know what she was trying to distance herself from.
Although Joan did not talk about her childhood, she found ways to express herself through art. David grew up in a household filled with his mother's paintings.
And some of my earliest memories were of going out and painting with her out in the garden, like plein air. My mom and I were so close. Not in a verbal way, but I would look at her and it was just, we'd give each other a little goofy look, a little goofy smile, an eye roll or a little giggle, and it was just, wow, totally connected. I'm no psychologist, but often children will take on the roles that they think will get the affection and the attention of their parents. So she painted, and I was following in her footsteps in a lot of ways.
Was she any good?
Her tall ship paintings, I think anyone would be awestruck by them. They're just very proficient, and there's energy, but I think she painted for therapy, in a way. I think she just wanted to zone out and paint and meditate. Of course, the sad kind of tragedy of it all is that wherever you go, there you are. You can try to run away, but it's inside to a large part. So
When David talks about his past today, it seems to me he's trying to put together pieces that perhaps were never there. Little incidents from his own past that can connect him to the grandfather he never knew. Like this story about shopping for books with his mother in Harvard Square in Cambridge.
And I just was in absolute paradise. My mom and I would just be pulling out books, buying books. We always bought a book. So one of those books was the Communist Manifesto, which I read and didn't understand, but I was, again, into it for whatever reason.
Here's another story he told me, which to me sounds borderline supernatural.
We did European vacations, Paris, London, whatever, and Rome. And I remember we went to London. I was, pretty young, and they lost me at I think it was the National Gallery, lost me because I was fixated on this painting, Manet's Execution of Maximilian. I just sat there for hours drawing it. It's only decades later that once I learned about how my grandfather was killed, there's this eeriness about it.
The more David learned about his grandfather, the more questions he had about his mother's past. His parents had never told him anything. His mother never spoke of the life she had before she came to the US. David had done his research and had found everything that was to be found in the written history. If he wanted to know more, he would finally have to ask his mother directly.
So the three of us, my father, my mother, and I, were in the den. So we were sitting on Lazy Boys recliner sofas. Television was on mute, and my dad had a glass of wine, and my mother was right in front of the television, as she always was. And I don't know how it started, but eventually I said to her, Mom, I know you don't want to get into it, but I just want to let you know that I'm learning a little more about your past, and I just want to let you know that it's okay. You didn't do anything wrong. I wanted her to feel okay and comfortable, that this wasn't going to be a distressing thing. Because remember, my whole life was, Mom is delicate, and we don't bring up anything that would jeopardize her peace. I just remember she just was looking at me as I was saying all this, saying nothing, and I go up to her, and I just was like apologizing, like I'm so sorry for her. And she just put her hand on my back of my head and just was like, it's okay. But even her voice, I remember it was just kind of just a bit detached, It's okay, it's okay. That's all she said. It's okay, all right, okay, it's all right. I love you, hope you're okay, but we're done here.
David had no idea what to do next. He had finally broached the subject with his mother, but she wasn't going to answer any of his questions. It seemed like David had reached a dead end. But then, I discovered something. A bizarre coincidence could lead us deeper into Joan's past.
Paul was a very good friend of my father's, and they adopted 2 girls. So the girls came to the United States, but Joan was the older, and she had seen so much more. She was quiet, she was shy, and she didn't know English. But what I loved best of all was seeing how those parents absolutely adored their adopted children. They adored them. Although now, as I look back, I understand the political significance of these adoptions.
That's on the next episode of Born Greek, Made American. Born Greek, Made American is a co-production of Melon Media and the non-for-profit journalistic organization IMED. It is created and hosted by me, Katerina Bakogianni. Additional reporting and fact-checking from Dimitris Manis. Editing, mixing and sound design by Evangelos Makris and Dimitris Kokovidis. Our theme music is composed by Evangelos Makris. Executive producers were Nikos Aronis and Panayotis Menegos for IMED, and me for Melon Media. A big thank you to Campsite Media's Vanessa Grigoriadis for her support to the series from the very beginning. And special thanks to Honda van Steen. Born Greek is based on her book Adoption, Memory and Cold War Greece, Quid Pro Quo, and it could not have happened without her. The CIA agent was voiced by Dan Knight.